Okay, good morning, class. This is the online class of spring 2020. Last video that you saw me doing was last year's class, so if the date seemed funky to you, that would be why. I don't always do a video lecture. Poetry tends to be a little more complicated simply because you haven't had as much exposure to poetry as you have to other forms of literature. So I'd like to go ahead and give at least one video lecture today on John Donne. And then if it goes well, if I can get this done in a timely fashion, then I'll also go ahead and give one to you on The Chariot by Emily Dickinson. Okay, so we'll dive right in. I'm going to talk about the slides as they appear and try to give you a little more in-depth analysis of what's going on. I'm not going to read the slides because you can pause the video and you can take notes as you will. So I'll go quickly to expedite the whole lecture process, but you can pause it whenever of course you need to. Oh, you guys have that slide presentation, so you can just go through it at your own desire as well. Okay, Holy Sonnet 10. To begin with, it's also called Death Be Not Proud. This often happens with sonnets because Shakespeare does this as well. You know, Sonnet 23, Sonnet 56, whatever sonnet it happens to be, it just gets a number because he writes so many of them. When that happens, often what they do is rename the sonnet, or they give it the name of the first line, which is what you're seeing here. So this one, in addition to the next one that we're doing, has really two titles, Holy Sonnet 10 and Death Be Not Proud by John Donne. All right, a little bit about Donne. I like to know a little bit about each poet. Not a lot. What century he was born in is helpful. His nationality, his culture, the culture in which he was raised, kind of important too, I think. But mostly, as far as the test goes, be able to identify the poets with the poem, okay? So John Donne, it looks like Dawn. It is not Dawn, it's Donne. He is a 17th century poet and a metaphysical poet, so lots of metaphors. I have here, like Andrew Marvell, but that's irrelevant to you for this class because I dropped Marvell's poem for sake of time this year. Notably, chaplain at St. Paul's Cathedral in England, so that's a huge deal, and he was also personal chaplain to King James. That's King James of the King James Bible. So this is a very notable, significant man in history. Great poetry, interesting life. He, for just the sake of background, very much a wild child growing up. He converted later in life. His earlier poetry, scandalous. He has one called The Flea, which is pretty sexual. There's a lot of, he delved into kind of scandalous poetry when he was younger and a little more wild. He had a conversion to Christianity, and then from that point forward, his poetry was mostly spiritual. And he became a very, very devout Christian, as you can tell. All right, so this is what's going on in the world historically, which I've already addressed. Also know this is right during the same time that Shakespeare was around, right? So sonnets were pretty prevalent, Shakespearean sonnets were pretty prevalent. The sonnet itself was a form of poetry that was widely used. All right, so the idea here, again, you know this TP-Cast well. The first thing you're supposed to do before you dive into even read the poem, is you're supposed to take a look at the title and see what you can determine just by the title, because typically, with a classical analysis of literature, the title should definitely have something to do with the theme of the poem or tie into it at some level. It's not just a random thing. Now, if we go with Holy Sonnet 10, there's not a lot you can do with that, right? The only thing you can determine with Holy Sonnet 10 is that it is indeed a sonnet. We don't know whether it's Petrarchan or Spenserian or Shakespearean, but we know it's a sonnet, so we know it's a 14-line poem. We know if it says holy, then we know it's a spiritual poem. And if it says 10, we know that he's written at least 10 of them. That's really all you can determine, and nothing really plays into theme there except for the fact that you know it's going to be spiritual at some level because of the holy. The revised title, Death Be Not Proud, definitely tells us more. So typically when I ask a class, hey, what would you think this poem is going to be about, or what its message is going to be based on Death Be Not Proud? And typically students say, well, death shouldn't be proud, okay? That's typically the answer I get. There's no wrong answer for your test, number one. There is no wrong answer for this box. As long as you take a stab at what you think the title might signify, you get the points for that. So make sure you're aware of that. All right. Okay, so before I paraphrase it, I'm going to read it to you. Poetry should be read aloud so that you can get a sense of the meter and you can hear the rhyme. Hopefully you've already viewed my lecture on meter. Again, teachers avoid it just because it's a little convoluted, it's a little complex, and students have difficulty grasping it, but I like the meter, and I think it's important to give you some exposure to it. As I'm reading this, see if you can hear the meter. It's just like the beat in music, okay? Just the beat that's emphasized in music, it's emphasized in poetry. So as I read it, see if you can hear it. Eventually, I'd like you guys to get to the point where you're able to identify what the type of meter is. Death be not proud. Death be not proud, though some have called thee mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. For those whom thou think'st thou dost overthrow, die not, poor death, nor yet canst thou kill me. From rest and sleep, which but thy pictures be, much pleasure then from thee much more must flow. And soon our best men with thee do go, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men, and dost with poison, war, and sickness dwell. And poppy and charms can make us sleep as well. And better than thy stroke, why swell'st thou then? One short sleep past, we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death, thou shalt die. Okay, if I were to paraphrase it, for a sonnet, only 14 lines, you know that. So it's easy to take it line by line, which is what I'd recommend in a short poem. The one you have for your test coming up will be extremely short. I think there's maybe only 8 to 10 lines. For that, when you paraphrase, I want to see a paraphrase in your own words of each line. It will really help with the literal meaning. And before you do anything, you want to understand what the poem is saying literally, and then you can get to the figurative underlying meaning, okay? So if I were to say, hey, let's paraphrase this, let's put this into our current vernacular and see if we can simplify it. First line. I have first 2 lines here. Don't be proud, death, even though some are terrified of you. You aren't terrifying. The people you think you are conquering don't really die, and you can't kill me either. Line 5 to 6. You really just look like sleep, and because everyone likes a good nap, you must be even better. 7 to 8. All the good men die young, and are the first to experience the rest that they really deserve. 9 and 10. You are a subordinate of destiny, bad luck, rulers, suicidal men. Okay, you see how I've actually paraphrased it all here? And you hang out with the likes of poison, war, and sickness. You hang out with the riffraff. 11 and 12. Opium can put us to sleep. That's poppies, right? Easily. So why do you think you're so important if we have little things like drugs that can do the same thing? Last 2 lines. After a little nap, we're going to wake and we're going to live forever. But you, death, will be conquered permanently. Line by line, come up with your own way of saying exactly what they're saying, just in your own words. Now, hopefully, 80% of this you're going to get right. Every once in a while I have students that don't understand the literal. Hopefully that won't happen too much to you, and the bulk of the literal you'll get, so you get the gist of the poem. So often somebody will read a poem like Death Be Not Proud, get to the end of the 14 lines and say, I have absolutely no idea what they're saying, because the language tends to be a little more complicated. Once you do this, then you should know. Take it apart, piece by piece, parse it out and unpack it, and then figure out on a literal level what it's saying. Now we know what it's saying, right? It's not saying, don't be proud of death. It's saying, death, capital D, generally personification of death, like Hades, don't be proud. Death, you're not such a big thing. Death, you're not such a big scary thing. So we really have the edge on you, death. okay? So it's more of, that's what he's saying. All right, so the most important section, and this is going to be very true for your paper as well, is the C section, I call it, the connotation section of the TP cast. You're going to find those poetic devices, those literary devices, and you are going to address them, label them as such, and then suggest why the poet, why the speaker may have actually chosen to use that particular device. What is he trying to get at here, okay? So first and foremost, and this is going to be true for our next poem as well, when you see death capitalized with a big capital D, you should start thinking, oh, we're making this a proper noun. Death is capitalized. It's important, yes, but it's being personified like a proper noun. Who is death? We all know Hades, all right? So death is a prominent feature, especially in the 1600s, the 1600s. Death is a very prominent feature. People tend to be a little afraid of death. Death tends to be a little scary. So why in a poem would you personify it, make it a person, death, an actual person? The reason you would do that is to weaken its power. Because if it's this huge entity that we can't overcome, it's a little scarier. But if we make it into a person, it's more on our level and it's more conquerable. So he's personified death pretty much all the way through this sonnet. He's personified it. That is significant. He is trying to get his audience, the people that he's speaking to not be so scared of it, to not be so daunted by it. All right, huge. So if you're going to do this poem for your paper, personification is probably your biggest, going to be your longest paragraph. Well, they should all be about equal, quite honestly, but you're going to have so much information on personification. Conceit. Okay, so a conceit, and again, if you have any issues with my literary terms, let me know. You can look them up. They're all in your textbook as well. Conceit is also known as an extended metaphor. You know what a metaphor is. So an extended metaphor is just a long metaphor. So a conceit is, over the course of a few lines or even the whole poem, what's being compared to what, right? Well, we're obviously comparing, in a number of lines here, death to sleep. Now, why would he compare death to sleep? For the same reason as personification, right? If I tell my audience that the death is really just a good nap, it becomes just a little less scary, doesn't it? So nobody's quite, again, as daunted by death if we start seeing it in terms of just a good night's sleep. All right, that's a conceit. A little metaphor on one line. Death, thou art a slave to men, okay? If death is a slave, you are a slave to men. Again, that's a metaphor, right? We're comparing two unlike things. Death, you're a slave to men. Why would he say death is a slave of men? Again, to weaken it. So if his audience starts saying death is not this great, terrifying entity or thing that's going to happen to them, but they start seeing it as a slave to them, it weakens death's power over them. Rhyme scheme. Again, this was all in your textbook, so I'm assuming you've read it and you've taken notes and you know what these terms are. If you don't, you need to go back and take a look again at your textbook and do some research, because I'm going to expect you to know it when I'm teaching it. I expect you to know these terms in the PowerPoints, and I expect you to know them for the test. Rhyme scheme. So this is a Petrarchan sonnet. Again, there's three types of sonnets in this era, Spenserian, Shakespearean, and Petrarchan. They each have 14 lines, but their rhyme scheme is just a little bit different for each one. This one's rhyme scheme is first stanza, and sometimes it looks like they've got them in stanzas for a sonnet, sometimes it doesn't, okay? In the textbook, it does not. But first 4 lines, A, B, B, A. Second 4 lines, A, B, B, A. C, D, D, C. Okay. This is significant for the third stanza, or the third grouping of 4 lines, because typically in a TP cast, when you're looking for your TP cast, the shift usually starts right here with the first line that's not rhyming, okay? So if you ever have trouble, you look 3/4 of the way through the sonnet and just look for the shift there, because typically poems start off, let's say, melancholic and sad, and then 3/4 of the way through the poem, the poet figures something out and changes his tune. So it shifts his attitude to something a little more happy or content or peaceful 3/4 of the way through. That's the beauty of the shift. Usually the theme is found somewhere in that shift, that he's discovered something, he's had an epiphany. So CDC for the third set of 4 lines, and then the last 2 lines in a sonnet are always a couplet. But this is an interesting one here, right? Because the last 2 lines in this one are, "One short sleep past we wake eternally, and death shall be no more. Death thou shalt die, eternally die." Well, unless I say it eternally die or eternally d, it really doesn't rhyme, does it? So in poetry, we call this an approximate rhyme. It's sometimes called a slant rhyme. It's even referred to, believe it or not, as a close enough rhyme. It's a stretch, but poets generally do it with purpose. Usually they're trying to make a word jump out at you because you expect it to rhyme. The whole idea of the sonnet is that everybody in this day and age knew exactly what to expect from a sonnet. Oh, a sonnet's going to be iambic pentameter. A sonnet is going to have that, that rhyme scheme that's either going to be Petrarchan or Shakespearean at this point. So your last couplet, the audience expects that to rhyme. It jumps out at them. What jumps out at them? It's not eternally, right? Because then you're expecting the E last syllable to just kind of finish the couplet just beautifully, and it's not there. It die. So the emphasis here is on the word die. It jumps out at you. It is not what you expect it to be, and that is significant. Again, Donne here is taking a concept like death that people are afraid of, and he's putting it into a typical form that people know extremely well, the form of poetry. And then he's shaking it up. He's shaking it up right here with a couple of things. I'm going to present death in a way you don't expect it. I'm going to do this in a way you don't expect it. And I'm going to end this in a way you don't expect it. I want the word die to jump out at you. Why? Because you're not dying. You will live forever. Death will be conquered, is what he's saying. He wants to make that significant to you as you read it. All right. Okay, still in the C section, the connotation. The meter, just like the rhyme, you expect with the meter, hey, it's a sonnet, I know what I'm getting, I'm going to get iambic pentameter, because Shakespeare right now is making iambic pentameter so popular, and you read it, and the first line doesn't trouble you. Death be not proud, though some have called thee. Okay, while I have you here for a minute, called. You see that little accent in the book, and you hear me say called. Okay, it's like Shakespeare with Romeo and Juliet. Banished, thou callest me banished? Why would I say banished and not banished? Why would I say called and not called? Because I'm adding an extra syllable. Why? I'm adding an extra syllable in order to make the iambic pentameter work. I have to have that ed accented, or I only have 9 syllables on that line. And for iambic pentameter, I need 10. Ba-bum, 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 right? So that's exactly what he does. If you see that in poetry, you know what the poet's doing. The same way it works in reverse, okay? It's down here, canst. Thou canst something, okay? He doesn't say thou cannot. Cannot is 2 syllables. He can only have 1 syllable, or his meter is going to be off. So he takes it and he makes it into a contraction. And when you see those weird contractions in poetry, like or instead of over, or air instead of ever, it's to buy them, or to minus themselves a syllable, okay? You buy it with a called, and you minus it with a canst. All right, but back to the point here, the meter on the first line is iambic pentameter. It's great, it's exactly what you expect. The second line then hits you out of the blue. Ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. Mighty and dreadful, for thou art not so. Wait a minute, that's not iambic pentameter. Mighty, that's trochaic. And dreadful, okay? So all of a sudden he throws it off. And then if you weave your way through the rest of the poem, the rest of the sonnet, you see, oh, wait a minute, he's like completely erratic with this meter. He's not abiding by typical sonnet form as typical sonnet meter. Why is he doing this? He knows how to write in using good meter and iambic pentameter for sonnets. Well, he's doing this again. He's trying to shake it up. This is what you don't expect. Yeah, this is a sonnet, and I'm going to talk about death. I'm going to give you something you don't expect. Now, this guy's a chaplain. He's given homilies. He's given sermons every Sunday. He starts out with something and then he wants to make it memorable. He wants to make a point. He's going to do something a little different to drive his message home. Don't think about death the way you've always thought about death. I'm going to present it differently. And what you think you're going to hear, I'm going to give you something entirely different. All right. Alliteration and repetition. Repetition is also called tautology. Okay, so there you see some words that are used again and again and again, and some consonant sounds at the beginning of words that are also being used again and again. Death, die, death, 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 die, right? So lots of that being emphasized. Also much more must, good alliteration there, that you've got to be even better than a long nap, death. Why? Just for emphasis on death, dying, and not people dying. All right, attitude. So what is the tone of the speaker? Your goal here is to find at least two, okay, sometimes three, but at least two, because one of them is going to be a shift, right? So what is the tone of this poem that you are finding? And he's belittling death, right? He's condescending. He's patronizing death. He seems like he's dauntless. I'm not daunted by death. I'm fearless about it. And he's challenging the speaker is challenging his audience to do the same. He's also challenging death himself and saying, it's more like if you want to fight me, you're going to come out on the losing side because you are nothing. Shift. All right. I would argue that in line 9, when he says 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Yes. You'll notice that poetry is always numbered for the lines at the sides. That's for your convenience. And when you write papers about your first paper, you'll have to use the line number. So make sure you always are aware of how they're marking line numbers. Okay. So, much a pleasure, then from thee much more must flow, rest of their bones and soul's delivery. Thou art a slave to fate, chance, kings, and desperate men. I go from dauntless, I'm not afraid of you, death, because you're just a good nap, to condescending. You're less than a good nap. You're kind of pathetic because you hang out with the riffraff. Okay, so I would say it goes from I'm not afraid of you to really, you are so nothing, and you're kind of pathetic. So I would argue the shift is right in there. Last T, again. Okay, sometimes you don't come up with something different. Sometimes you do. For this poem, typically, students do. They all of a sudden realize, oh, it's not saying, let's not be proud about death. It's saying, this is definitely a religious sonnet about eternal life. And if we're personifying death, we're saying, death, you've got nothing to be proud about. Okay, so what's the theme here? And as as good Christian kids growing up in the church, you probably have seen this coming. You've seen it coming all the way. You have hymns that you've sung about this concept. And the entire idea here is, right out of Corinthians, where, O death, is thy victory? Where, O death, is thy sting? You are nothing. You're not, death, you're not going to, where's your victory? You're not going to win. Where's your sting? You're not even going to hurt me. So this is, again, such a great, he's a chaplain. This is a homily. This is a sonnet that he's giving as a homily. And the message is right from the Bible. He's taken scripture, he's using it, he turns it into a sonnet and says, to everyone, death is not to be afraid of. It should be embraced, because we know where our eternal life lies, and we know right in the Bible it says that death will be conquered. All right, I'm going to let you take a look at this one yourself. Again, I'd always recommend the issue of theme for the paper. It's just the easiest approach. I've done this class for 5 years, and it's always seems to be the most straightforward paper. So I'd recommend it. Okay, I'm going to go on to Dickinson here in just a moment.